When I was a kid, I liked to take a bath. And it wasn't because I liked getting clean, and it wasn't even because I liked to relax my muscles in hot water, which is basically the only reason I take a bath today. It's all right, Kendall, I actually do bathe. I just take showers instead. But no, I like to take a bath because my mom let me have toys in the bathtub. Now, there were all kinds of fun toys that she would let me have. There was a boat that had some people you could put on the boat that would float around. There were some things that were they're almost like dog toys, and they had holes in the bottom of them so I could squirt the water at myself and on the floor and at the wall. And I'm sure that afterwards it got really good and moldy inside and probably made me sick. But I love playing with those toys in the bathtub. And that was the main reason I was okay with taking a bath. But my favorite part of the bath was the end. Because at the end, I would open up that drain and I would watch the water spin like a tornado. And I loved to watch the water spin like a tornado. And I would always leave my floating toys in the tub as I got out. And I would watch as they were pulled toward that drain and circled around. On a really good day, when I'd spent most of the day outside, I could actually see the silt that had been washed off my body flow from the end of the tub and go around and get sucked down the drain. And those were the good days. That's what I really love. Those are the best baths I had. Maybe that's why I was so intrigued by the story of Lake Pignor. Anybody know the story? I just want to know. Anybody know the story of Lake Pignor? Okay, good. We're going to have a little bit of education day. I like that. Now, it's actually a lake in Louisiana. It is 2.5 hours from here. And if you drove to Lake Pignor today, it would look like a fairly normal lake with the exception of a random chimney just kind of hanging out in the water. But something extraordinary happened on that lake on November 20th, 1980. The day started as a normal day. There were people fishing on the lake, and deep below the surface of the lake, there was a functioning salt mine. It was functioning just like it had for decades. And out in the lake, just a little ways from shore, was a Texaco oil rig that was drilling that day, because not only was that area rich with salt, which was a wonderful resource, but also they found that because the salt was being pushed up in the Earth's crust, it also released something else very valuable, crude oil. And so they were looking to extract crude oil. The problem was, however, the Texaco had made a tiny little error in their math. And as the crew was drilling down into the earth under the lake with a 14-inch drill bit, they accidentally drilled into one of the shafts of the salt mine below. You can see that little dotted line there is where they accidentally drilled. And what happened then is that fortunately all the salt miners were actually able to escape. But very soon the lake began draining into the drill hole, through the drill hole into the mine shaft. And it became very quickly the world's largest bathtub drain. Here's a picture of how it started. You can see it right there in the middle. The lake started draining down this 14-inch drill hole into the mine shaft, and so it started getting worse and worse and worse, and all that water came down, and the force of the draining water started pulling everything in the lake down the hole like silt left over in a bathtub, including huge industrial barges that could not resist the force. They would circle and go right underneath the water into the shaft of the mine. And not only did the vortex suck down everything in the lake, but it actually also consumed 65 acres of land, all down the hole. And the force was so strong that a canal that led to the Gulf of Mexico actually reversed. It's one of the only times in recorded history that the Gulf of Mexico flowed north on more than just a tide level, pulling that water from the Gulf of Mexico into the lake, creating a 164-foot waterfall that is to this day the tallest waterfall ever in Louisiana. Now, when that disaster ended, the lake was changed forever. The shoreline was altered. Houses obviously ended up under the water with chimneys sticking out. And the water was no longer a freshwater lake. It was now a saltwater lake because the water that eventually filled the lake was from the Gulf of Mexico. Now, can you imagine something with such irresistible force that barges could not use their massive engines to escape it, that it sucked in complete buildings and land and just kept going down like a big bathtub drain. That's a lot of force if you think about it. But actually, I can think of an irresistible force that's similar to that. And I think we see it in the culture around us. I know you're tired of hearing from me that statistically speaking that the lives of Christians in America are not that different from people who don't follow Christ. I know you're tired of me saying that, but it's still true. It's still an issue that as a church, both here and across this country, we have to deal with. That we don't look that much different from our non-Christian counterparts. And the reason I think we don't look any different is that we're living in a veritable Lake Pignor. That the world around us is actually pretty attractive. It seems often harmless, and the things that aren't necessarily inherently sinful have a tendency to pull us in, and we follow that current, and it's a very, very difficult thing to resist. And by the way, we know, I believe wholeheartedly, that we are not called to isolate ourselves from the world, but to be a part of the world. And so we have to be careful about this irresistible current around us. It's hard not to be sucked into the mindset of the world around us because it's pretty dang attractive. It looks pretty good. And as we will cover in this week's purpose group meetings, the church is in a constant battle to go against the flow of individualism, of consumerism, and materialism. Simply put, we need to be different. And by the way, that's a common theme that you'll hear throughout this whole series, is that we as Christians need to live lives that are different. I like how Briscoe and Ford stated it in Missional Essentials. If you're in a purpose group, you're going to read this week. But basically they said that we live in a culture that is not very affected, or a church rather, that's not very affected by the things that we think should affect us. That we sat through countless sermons, that we go through countless Bible studies, that we go to church and we're a part of these activities, but in reality, what I said before is still true. That we don't look any different than our non-Christian counterparts. And that if we are going to be agents of change in this world, as God has called us to be, that we ourselves must be changed. I think that's vital. And today's passage is a reminder to us as to how we can resist the cultural vortex that that always threatens to drown us. If you have a Bible, you can turn to Hebrews 12. And there are two simple verses in Hebrews 12 that can help us recalibrate and be the changed people that God has called us to be. And it's at the first verses of Hebrews chapter 12, starting with verse 1. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles. And let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. So I want us to break down this verse. I want to see what we can glean from these two verses that can give us some tips, some help to kind of go against the flow, to avoid that current, that vortex that we live in. And I think it starts out with the very first part of this passage. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses. Now, here's a little bit of a Bible study tip that you've probably heard before, but at any time you're reading a passage and the word therefore appears at the beginning of a sentence, that means you need to look backwards. Because that means the writer is saying, because of what I just said, this is what you should do. And in this case, the writer of Hebrews mentions a great cloud of witnesses. Now, the language here is reflective of an athletic event. Last night, Carrie and I, we streamed the Hardin-Jefferson girls. They were in the state finals, and we got to watch it online and see that happen. And the great thing about high school basketball is the crowds are always nuts. And we were able to sense the excitement of the crowds on both sides cheering on those girls in the things that they were doing. It reminds me, actually, this passage does, of one of my favorite Arrowhead Stadium experiences that Carrie and I were a part of. It was a couple of years ago. I can't remember specifically when it was, but there's a defensive back named Eric Berry who plays for the Chiefs. And Eric Berry, in the middle of a season, had a chest pain and went to the trainer, and they did some tests and found out that he had cancer. He had lymphoma. And so obviously his season came to a stop, and he went into treatment for cancer, and they kind of cataloged some of the things that he was doing. Well, he not only beat cancer, but he also came back the next year to play football again. And so we were there the first game that he returned, the first home game that he was there. And they announced the players, and of course we knew that day they were going to announce Eric Berry. And I've never heard a stadium erupt for a player any louder than I heard them announce when they announced Eric Berry. And we were cheering for a couple of reasons. We were cheering because we were so proud and happy that he had beat cancer, and he was inspirational. He had met with a lot of other children and other people who were struggling with the same disease, and he was just I don't know anything about his personal life, but he had some things that really exhibited qualities that we thought were really great. So we cheered out where he came from, and we cheered for what we hoped he would be as a football player too, that he would help us win the game that day. And I think that's the scene we have surrounding us with this great cloud of witnesses. We have a great cloud of witnesses that cheers us on because they are happy from where we've come from and happy of who we are in Christ, but also are excited and hopeful for what we can do in the future. The word therefore then tells us who is actually making up that crowd. And we find them in Hebrews chapter 11, in the chapter previous to this passage. Now, I don't know if you know about Hebrews 11, but it's commonly known as the faith chapter. It includes a people in the Old Testament who exhibited the faith defined in that chapter. It first tells us what faith is, and then it says, here's a list of people that actually lived it out. And it mostly follows a simple formula. If you read through Hebrews 11, it starts out by saying, by faith, and then it has a name or a group, and then it says what they did, the action. So in other words, by faith Noah built an ark. By faith Abraham left his home. By faith Moses' family put him in a basket to save him. And when you boil it all down, each of the examples in Hebrews 11 have the same characteristic, is that their faith made them different. It's also known as a Faith Hall of Fame. And I don't know if you're familiar with the concept of a Hall of Fame, but if you're in a Hall of Fame, like the Football Hall of Fame or the Baseball Hall of Fame, it's because you have accomplishments that are different than the general population. You did things above and beyond. You did things that are different. And in the Faith Hall of Fame, it talks about people who did things different than the world around them. And so this crowd is not just cheering us on because of where we've come from, or is cheering us on, not only because of what they hope we can accomplish, but also because this crowd have experienced the difference that we should strive for, and that they know God can bring us through. Now, by the way, a little theological thing here. I don't believe that the writer of Hebrews meant that we have a literal crowd cheering us on. But he's saying, look to the example of these people. And since we know that they could do it, then we should do two things. The second part of that verse, let us throw off everything that hinders. A couple weeks ago, I ran my first half marathon ever. I'm actually training now to run a marathon in April, and in the middle of that training guide that I'm following, they said that halfway, if you can find a half marathon to run, it's a good idea to be a part of a race. Now, the goal, if you're going through this the first time, if you're not familiar, a half marathon is 13.1 miles typically, and that's the official length, and a marathon is 26.2, and they say the goal, your first time through, should just be to finish. You shouldn't worry about time. You shouldn't worry about how fast you are or how you place in the race. You should just be happy that you finished the race. And so it just so happened that the schedule fell at a time when Lainey and I were actually in Tennessee for a college visit. So I did a little searching on the internet, and I found a race east of Chattanooga. Now, I don't know if you know about the geography and the topography in Tennessee, but while Chattanooga, it may not be technically in the Smoky Mountains, it might as well be. And sure enough, when I got there, I quickly discovered that the 13.1 miles I was supposed to run was not a nice, flat, Texas-like road, but it was literally a mountain trail. A mountain trail, a rocky, muddy mountain trail. But not only that, the morning of the race, it was rainy, and it was cold, with temperatures in the lower 40s. And I've lived in Texas, southeast Texas, long enough that that's cold to me. So generally speaking, if you told me that I needed to be in conditions like that, this is the kind of suitcase that I would probably pack. If you told me that I was going to be in a situation like that, these are the kind of things that I would want to have. Let me see what I got here. Well, first of all, again, because I live in Southeast Texas, I want a nice shirt, a nice thermal shirt to keep me warm in those 40-degree weather. Along with that, let's see here. I definitely, if you're going to keep the top warm, you better keep the bottom warm. And by the way, I know I'm not mentioning the unmentionables. I'm trying to keep this PG for the video, so we'll just leave that aside. But here's the long johns that I would want there. Now, of course, because of the condition of the trail, I'm not going to wear my good jeans, but I got these big, bulky Rustler jeans that I got, and you can see they got paint on them, gray paint, probably from these walls actually. And I think that's what I would want to wear because I might get up muddy, and I don't want to worry about getting my jeans messy. So that's what I would have on too. Of course, to stay warm too, I want a sweatshirt, and I like a good sweatshirt. And since I was in Tennessee, I might as well wear my Johnson Bible College sweatshirt. It's Johnson University. That tells you how old I am and how old the sweatshirt is. But it's got the hood on it. That's kind of nice. And of course, I might even want a stocking cap on there too. But I want my good, nice, warm wool socks. I mean, the worst part about being in the cold to me is cold feet, right? The toes get cold. Oh, it's ridiculous and cold. And then, of course, a good coat. You got to have a good, nice, warm coat, and I would want that as well. And then, of course, because of the terrain, then I would want to probably have a good set of, don't let the turquoise, these are manly, don't let it fool you, these are manly man boots now, okay? These are good steel-toed, and actually they're waterproof, and so, they have pretty good ankle support, and I want to make sure that, because there was a lot of roots and a lot of rocks and that sort of thing, and so I want to make sure that I had it, and actually there was water I had to walk through or go through, so I'd want to have some good boots, and then of course, I want to keep my fingers warm, and I got my good work gloves here, and now, you bent my hat up. I can't believe how okay, so I got this cowboy hat. I'm not normally a cowboy hat guy these days, but, whenever my dad passed, I thought, at deer camp, there's got to be a cowboy hat, and so I actually bought a cowboy hat to wear at deer camp, and now I use it to work. I work with this, and so I think if you're out in on a mountain trail, you got to have a cowboy hat if you wear one, so that, and then, of course, because it was raining, I would probably take this emergency poncho, because I don't want to get wet, because if you're wet, it's, and cold and wet, it's just kind of miserable, and so you want to take this out, and then you want to put that over your body, and then you'll have it and keep you dry, keep you warm. So that's the pile of clothes that I would probably want to wear in a situation like that. Let me show you my other suitcase. So this is legitimately what I wore, okay? Okay, let's start out with my running shorts. These are what I wore, and they're nice and light, and they're red, and they're Adidas, and they're cool, and my kids dig it, so I like it, so that's good. And then to match that, I did wear a long sleeve. It's got a hood. It's also Adidas, because, I'm all about the brand, and lightweight, it's good, and I didn't wear the hood, like I said, but it's got the long sleeves on it, so that was my shirt. And then I had my socks. These are Thorlos. Thorlos are a very good running sock. They're about $15 per pair, but they are really thick, and they help keep you from getting blisters, and they're lightweight, and that's a good thing. And then along with my Thorlos, I have my Brooks Ghost 11 running shoes. These actually have about 285 miles put on them so far in my training, so I keep track of that, but they're nice and light. They're nice and cushiony. They're good to run in, and then because I didn't want to get sweat on my face, I always wear a headband when I run just to keep the sweat out of my eyes. And then because it was so cold, I did put on a stocking cap, and then I have these nice little cotton gloves that I put on to keep my hands warm so I wouldn't be too freezing. Now you see the difference in the piles? You see the difference in the piles? Because I wore this pile instead of that pile, not only was I able to finish this race, I got this fancy little medal for finishing first in my age group. Yeah, clap. Please clap. Yes. I am telling you this so you will clap for me. I'm just telling you that right now. I'll just throw it out there. And just to answer Jake's question, I think he's probably back somewhere. He's up there. Yeah, yes, there were more people in my age group. I had to beat at least 3 other people to get this medal. And this medal I got for being the first Texan to finish the race. Like, I was out of all the Texans in the race, I was the first place. Actually, I'm just kidding. This is a participation thing. There were no other Texans in the race. So, but you know, there's no way I would have finished in the maximum time. By the way, they said you have to finish at a certain time. You can't, basically a walking pace. You have to walk it in a certain amount of time. There's no way I would have finished that, let alone won my age group, if I would have put that pile of stuff on and tried to run that race. There's just no way. And by the way, there's nothing against the rules. I could have shown up with that pile of stuff on my body, and at the starting line, I would have had some weird looks, but they wouldn't have disqualified me. There's nothing wrong with that. But it just would have greatly held me back. It would have made me slower. In fact, as I was running the race, this became a burden, the stocking cap and the gloves. And so this was a 3-lap course, and after the first lap, I threw these at Laney's head because I didn't want them anymore. I didn't need them anymore because they were a burden. And what is true for my race should absolutely be true for our lives as well as Christians. That as we contemplate that journey that God has called us to, a journey of following Christ's example and making better and more disciples in our lives, that we need to take a look at our wardrobe, so to speak. We have to look at the culture around us. We have to discern what parts would be beneficial to our own lives and God's mission. And we have to identify what actually could hold us back, what could hinder us. And that might mean that we eliminate something that isn't necessarily against the rules. That's one thing I keep harping on, is that sometimes the biggest hindrances in our lives are not necessarily sinful. They're not necessarily something that is inherently sinful. It could just be something that is not vital to our purpose. But it also means that as we run the race of life, that we continually evaluate. That once in a while, we need to realize that there may be some aspect of our life, again, not necessarily bad or against the rules, that's holding us back. And just like my stocking cap and gloves in that race, we might realize something that was once useful, because by the way, they came in very handy when it was cold when I started out. It kept my head and my hands warm. There was a purpose for that, but then I realized that they were no longer useful and became a hindrance. And there may be something in our life that's the same way. That at one point was a good thing, but now it's become a hindrance. And that means it's time to chuck it. But the writer of Hebrews continues on and says, the second part of that, and the sin that so easily entangles. Now, it would have been dumb enough for me to go to the starting line with the race with all of those clothes on, but it would have been even dumber for me to try to finish a half marathon with one of these. You ever tried to do a potato sack race before? It's not easy. It's not easy. And I can promise you this one thing. I am not anywhere close to a fast, long-distance runner. When I run my marathon in April, by the way, don't count on me coming back with anything other than a participation medal. I'm not going to place in that because there's going to be about probably 1,000 people running that as opposed to 3 or 4 that ran this other one. 23, actually. But if you put me in my running clothes up against the best athlete in the world in one of those, on that same trail I ran the half marathon, put your money on me all the time. Put your money on me every time. I guarantee you I could outrun someone in a gunny sack any day, especially if it was on that rough mountain trail. But that's exactly what we do when we attempt to navigate life while simultaneously aiding and abetting the enemy when it comes to sin. Now, notice this is actually an extension of what the writer said earlier. He said we should throw off everything that hinders. Again, things that aren't necessarily sinful, things that aren't necessarily against the rules, throw off those, and, there's that word, and the sin that so easily entangles. What we should throw off, the truth is that we won't be able to completely remove our mistakes and our failings from our life. We will always struggle with this idea of sin and our sinful nature. But there is a big difference between stumbling over sin in our life and in our race and intentionally stepping into a metaphorical gunny sack that will inevitably and continually cause us to fall. And that's what many of us do every morning, every day. Not that we're just walking along and there's sin and we are tempted and we give in to temptation and we stumble and fall, but that we literally take out our gunny sack and we step into it. That sin is a choice. It's kind of like a pet. If you have a pet, you care for that pet. You feed that pet. You want to make sure that pet is okay. And I think for many of us, we treat our sin like a pet. We want to protect it. We want to keep it hidden, of course. We want to feed it. We want to let it have a small place in our life. Now, notice that this verse says the sin that easily entangles. Now, this is a bit confusing because we don't all struggle with the same thing. I mean, my pet sin is different than yours, perhaps. It may be the same, but most likely we struggle with different sins. I mean, maybe it's one of the ones that I mentioned earlier. Maybe it's individualism. We have a tendency to just reject community. We have a leave me alone mentality. We're all about ourselves and focusing on ourselves and doing it ourselves and whatever it might be. Or maybe it's consumerism, that we're in this give me more kind of mindset. Or maybe it's an addiction, which is really the nth degree of consumerism. Just can't get enough, and I got to have this of whatever the product is, be it drugs or alcohol or sex or shopping or whatever it might be. Or maybe it's materialism. It's this constant give me stuff. I got to fill this hole with stuff. But no matter what it is specifically, no matter what that pet sin might be for us, every sin we struggle with has one thing in common. And the writer of Hebrews can say the sin because at the core of every sin is selfishness, in which we put ourselves above all else, in which we put ourselves above God, in which we put ourselves above others. I tried really hard to think of a sin that does not fall into that category of selfishness. And I think that is the sin that so easily entangles. How it manifests itself can be different, but that is the sin. But that sin not only entangles us, it destroys us. Let me tell you, on this little trail that I was running, there were parts that if I was wearing a gunny sack, I probably would have died because I would have fallen over a cliff into a lake. And I think that the sin that entangles us, not only does it lead to stumbling and falling, it actually leads to our destruction. I mean, the Bible is very clear, right? The wages of sin is death. And I think we need to take that very seriously. And so we must identify those sins that we cultivate. We must chuck them as well. And then the writer of Hebrews continues, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. Now, two things in this verse here. First of all, perseverance, better termed as persevering endurance. We got to keep going. We got to keep plugging along. We can't give up. But this is where we rely on the therefore that we talked about earlier, that if they can do it, we can do it. You may have heard this list before, but I think it bears repeating. Think about some of the heroes of the Bible, some of them that are included in that Faith Hall of Fame, that Noah was a drunk, and Abraham was too old, and Jacob was a liar, and Joseph was abused, and Moses had a stuttering problem, and Gideon was afraid, and Rahab was a prostitute, and Jeremiah was too young, and David was an adulterer, not to mention a murderer, and Elijah was suicidal, and Jonah ran from God, and Job went bankrupt, and Peter denied Christ, and all of the disciples fell asleep while praying and ran away when Jesus really needed them. Martha worried about everything. Mary Magdalene was demon-possessed. Paul was a Christian killer, and Lazarus was dead. Yet God used them, and He worked in them, through them, and in spite of them at times. Oftentimes, the only thing we need to do for God to use us mightily is simply to not give up. Sometimes the only thing we need to do for God to work through us is just to keep on going, to persevere, and to not give up. But then notice the second part. It says the race marked out for us. If we're going to be different from the cultural current that so easily draws us in and away from God, we must chuck what hinders us, the things that hinder us and hold us back. We must chuck the sin that entangles us. We must persevere and not give up. But we really have to make sure continually that we are on the right path. When I was about to run this half marathon, they made one thing very clear, that we were to follow the path with the blue flags. That was an important thing. There were a lot of trails out on this mountain. And if you didn't follow the trail with the blue flags, you were going to end up who knows where. And so there were all sorts of detours and unofficial trails that diverged from the path that we were supposed to run, and some of them even had signs pointing, saying, go this way. But the organizers of the race had placed these small blue flags all along the way to help make sure that we were headed in the right direction and that we always knew that we were on the right path. Now you see, even though our individual paths are different, the path that God sets before His people is always characterized by things that reflect and honor Him. We have these little flags that we can look for. That if you're on a path of obedience, where obedience is a consistent part of your life, then you're probably on the right path. That if you're on a path of community, where you're interacting and building one another up as God has called, then you're probably on a decent path. If you're on a path of mission in which your life is focused on helping others come to know the love of Christ and to be redeemed in every area of the life, you're probably on the right path. If you're on a path where love for others without discrimination is key, then I think you're probably on the right path. If you're on a path of restoration where you are continually engaged in restoring the world to its intended state, then you're probably on the right path. And these are some of the flags that we can look for to make sure that we are on the right path and we're on the different path. But there's one more tip. Verse 2. Fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. For the joy set before Him, He endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. When I was on that trail, one of the biggest struggles by the second lap is that what used to be just a bit muddy on the first lap became very slippery and dangerous in places the more people ran through it. In fact, there was one spot that was very steep and very slippery. I actually fell down and scraped up my hands and my knees. It was very dangerous. And so at one point in the second lap, I caught up with a couple of ladies who were running in front of me. And they weren't going much slower than me, and I realized something, that I could go ahead and pass them on this narrow path, or if I stayed behind them, I could watch them. And I could watch them run and see both where the trail went and also where the best footing was. And so for quite a while, I stayed behind these two ladies as I saw them go around the muddy spots and go on to solid ground. And I just followed their footsteps everywhere they went just to kind of keep going. I eventually passed them, but for the moments that I was following them, I was actually able to run with a lot more ease. I was able to relax and know that I was going to be safe as I ran through that trail. Well, the writer of Hebrews reminds us that on top of casting off the hindrances of sin, in addition to persevering and making sure that we are on the right path, sometimes going against the current is just as simple as keeping our eyes on Jesus and following Him. Now, that sounds super simple and super churchy, and it is, but you have to understand what that actually means on a practical level. See, Jesus is the author. He's the pioneer of our faith, which means He blazed the trail in the first place. He's the perfecter of our faith, which means He's gone ahead of us. He's Jesus who has finished the race once and for all and has sit down at the right hand of God. And it almost seems too simple, but if we simply get behind Jesus and follow Him down the path, He will lead us where we need to go. And you can bet that if we truly follow Jesus, that we're going to be moving against the flow of the world around us. Church, I think we have some important reflection to truly engage in. I think that it's definitely time for us to evaluate our lives for hindrances. To say, what in my life is holding me back from achieving the things that God has called me to? What is one thing that I could eliminate from my life that would give me more time or more resources or more opportunities to love someone as Christ does? I think it's definitely time to be honest and identify the sin that we may be harboring in our lives. Because it's just like a gunny sack in our walk with Christ. It's holding us back. It's going to trip us up. And we may be able to hide it for a long time, but it's keeping us from doing what God has called us to and from achieving that full life He's promised. I think it's time to check ourselves to see if we may have given up because maybe some aspect of our lives or some aspect of our faith was just too hard, and we'll say, I'm going to do this stuff later. I'm going to worry about reaching people for Jesus later. I'm going to just focus on this right now. Maybe we've given up. I think it's time to check the flags to see that we are on the right path, to make sure that our lives are defined by the things that God would define them by. And I think it's time that we finally actually look up from our run and see who's in front of us and see who is truly leading us. Who are we truly following to see if it's really Jesus? And I think that if we find that something does not align with God's intentions, then we have an important choice to make. On November 20th, 1980, this man, Leonce Viator Jr., was on Lake Peigneur with his nephew fishing for catfish. If that's not a Louisiana story, I don't know what is. When all of a sudden, his 14-foot fishing boat was being pulled along, and he saw what he identified as an eye in the ground measured 100 feet in diameter. As you can imagine, it was at that moment that Leonce had to make a decision. And the current was too strong. But as a huge barge was actually sucked into the hole and turned upside down, it disrupted the current just long enough for him and his nephew to race that boat against the current to the shore, where he actually tied his boat to a big pecan tree. And he later watched as the current took not only his boat, but the tree that it was tied to down into the hole. Church, if in our evaluation we find ourselves in the tug of the cultural current, we have a choice to make. Are we going to stay and try to navigate it and kind of paddle our way out of it? Or are we going to race to shore and escape to where God has called us to be? We have to choose to have different priorities, to have kingdom values, to have that be our top priority. We must see sin differently. It's not just something that we kind of, it's not just a struggle. It is actually something that will destroy us. We got to have different goals in our life to move from the goals of this world to the goals of the kingdom of God. We must be on a different road that is characterized by the flags of God's kingdom, but we must focus our eyes and our hearts and our lives on the author and the perfecter of our faith, Jesus. And only then can we escape that current that leads to destruction. We have a choice to make. Let's pray. Heavenly Father God, it is so easy to just go with the flow. But help us to realize, Lord, that just like that lake in 1980, that there is destruction that ends at the end of that flow, that we're headed down a vortex that will lead to our own demise if we decide to stay into that current. And God, I pray you'll help us to identify the things that hinder us and help us to cast them off. Help us to identify the sin that is entangling us and let us step out of that gunny sack and cast it off. Let us identify the areas of our life where we've given up or we've just put things on pause, and let us return to persevering. Lord, let us evaluate the road we are on to make sure that we are on your road, on the trail you have set out for us. And Lord, I pray you'll help us to, together, know Jesus better and more each and every day, so that when we look up, we can know without a doubt that the one we are following in this world and in this life is the author and perfecter of our faith. Help us to race our boats off of the current and into your arms. Give us the boldness, the courage, and the strength to do that. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Let's stand as we sing.